Okay, so for the imperialism background reading, the role of free laborers in the success of industrialization. Free laborers were an essential part of industrialization because they provided the labor needed to operate new machines in the factories. When factories were being built, they needed workers to obviously work factories so they could produce products. You can't work. No workers meant there were no products being produced. Russia was a nation that fell victim to not having many free laborers. Most of Russia's peasants, who were the lower class people who would traditionally have worked in the factories, were serfs who were bound to work on the land which they lived. This caused an issue for Russia, as these serfs could not leave and work in newly developed factories. This meant that Russia was behind many other nations in terms of industrialization. It was not until serfdom was abolished in 1861 that they really started to industrialize and move into a modern society. The way of colonization in the second half of the 19th century. During the height of industrialization in the second half of the 19th century, wealthy business owners were looking to make as much profit as they could. More new raw materials were needed to supply the increase in industrialization. The creation of new inventions meant that the natural supply of raw materials such as oil, petroleum, coal, and rubber was unable to supply enough the supply in the United States was unable to supply enough to meet the increased production demands of this newly industrialized society. This meant that business owners looked elsewhere to find the raw materials they needed at a discounted price. Many nations in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific had yet to be industrialized, but they contained mass amounts of the natural resources needed for industrialization. Business owners and politicians decided that conquering these nations and getting control over them meant that their raw materials could be exploited back to factories for the cheapest price. This was the primary goal driving this new wave of colonization. Foreign nations were not conquered to gain new territory or settlement like colonization in the past. For example, like the United States, the British did not colonize the British in the United States. The British colonized here for settlement, just to create new homes and new land. But this new colonization is all industry, all business, purely for raw materials. These new nations were conquered merely to take advantage of their natural resources so business owners could produce as much as they could with as much profit as possible. How did industry and industrial inventions aid colonization? Many industrialized nations wanted to conquer unclaimed territory in Africa that had valuable resources. Unfortunately, this meant they had to battle extreme conditions that were different from their challenges in the West. Following rivers was the easiest way for nations and troops to get deep into African territory. They did this with the newly developed steamboats. Steamboats would carry soldiers armed with newly invented weapons like rifles, handguns, and machine guns, explorers and traders deep into African nations. Newly invented steamboats, weapons, and medicines made travel in remote African nations much easier for these industrialized nations looking to conquer the territories. Africa, why was Europe largely unsuccessful in colonization? Prior to the industrialization of the 19th century, European nations had difficulty colonizing nations in Africa. This is due to the difficult terrain, climate, and disease that were much different from the territories conquered in Europe. New inventions of the Industrial Revolution made colonization in remote countries much easier than ever before. European nations raced to conquer land in Africa because they knew how important the natural resources would be for their continued growth. The race to conquer territories in Africa is known as the Scramble for Africa. European nations poured an immense number of resources into their projects in order to colonize Africa. By the end of the 19th century, about 90% of Africa was controlled by European nations. Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany controlled a majority of the territory, with Portugal, Spain, and Italy controlling some smaller territories. The civilizing mission. When industrialized nations moved to conquer the territory of lesser unindustrialized nations, they were mainly searching for an abundance of natural resources like in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. They wanted these resources to help their industrialization, but they also believed that they were helping these underdeveloped countries in the process. The larger nations believed it was their divine right to help civilize the world and incorporate elements of modern society into underdeveloped countries. Their markets introduced new products and inventions into countries who couldn't make it themselves. These products were outrageously expensive, but they were still on the market. The United States believed this idea when conquering the Philippines. They believed that it was part of the mission of our race to create civilization throughout the world. And then in terms of resistance, when industrialized nations conquered territories, many people were not happy with the new rules, people, traditions that were implemented into their nations. This led to revolts and resistance towards the industrialized Western nations. When resistance against European rule erupted in Japan, Britain, France, Germany, the US, Japan, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Eight-Nation Alliance to suppress the revolution. The forming of this alliance would make resistance to European powers inefficient, as their militia would be able to take control of the resistance, and then the European powers would still conquer the territory. Thank you.